They never told you the whole truth. They said your body is a vessel, that your DNA is a biological script, an inheritance of flesh and blood. But what if that script was written not just with matter, but with memory? What if your DNA isn't just a record of where you came from, but a map of where you can go? Not in miles, not in years, but in realities. Because hidden in the forbidden pages of ancient knowledge, the kind burned, buried, and branded as myth was a secret. That the human being is not bound to one world. That inside us exists a technology of consciousness, so advanced, so subtle, that it can bend the veil between dimensions. And now, finally, quantum science is starting to see it. They called it superstition. They called it magic. But now, researchers whisper about non-locality, superposition, wave function collapse. They're describing the same thing sages did in caves thousands of years ago, in different language. And this is the bridge between physics and mysticism, between brain and soul, between the self you've always known and the self that remembers everything. Because when you shift your awareness, when your intention pierces the noise of thought, when your emotions vibrate in coherence with a forgotten truth, your DNA listens. It responds, not passively, not chemically, but quantically. You are not separate from the field. You are part of it, encoded with the ability to access other timelines. Not just imagine them, not just dream about them, but inhabit them through frequency, through remembrance, through the grimoire written not on paper, but in your very cells. If this is touching something ancient inside you, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Because time is about to lose its meaning. Let's begin. The first civilizations weren't primitive. They were encoded with a language that wasn't written but woven into rituals, into symbols, into sound, because they understood something we've forgotten, that reality is not solid, it's structured by resonance. And the body, specifically your DNA, is the instrument that plays it. Not metaphorically, literally. They carved spirals into stone, not for decoration, but to mirror the geometry of the inner coil, the helix within. They aligned temples with star systems not to worship the sky, but to tune the body to celestial rhythms. They spoke of gods walking between worlds, not as fantasy, but as a memory of what humans could once do before the code was suppressed. Before we were taught to forget. But the code is still there, waiting. Dormant strands of DNA, labeled junk by modern science, may in fact be the very key to accessing alternate versions of self. And the key to unlocking them is not physical force, it's conscious resonance. Every emotion you feel sends instructions. Every thought you repeat sets a frequency. And those frequencies travel through the body, through the blood, through the double helix. And in doing so, they shift your position in the field. Have you ever had a day where nothing made sense, but somehow everything aligned? Or a moment that felt pulled from a dream you never remembered dreaming? That wasn't coincidence. It was overlap. A brief alignment with another timeline, one where your signal matched a different version of reality. Because each timeline is a frequency band. And when your internal state shifts, so does your position in the grid. You don't go anywhere. Reality comes to you, and the portal is your DNA, a living antenna transmitting your consciousness into the quantum sea. So if you felt the pull toward something inexplicable, a life that feels familiar but unreal, a path you didn't take but still dream about, you may not be imagining it. You may be remembering, because memory isn't just stored in the mind. It's stored in the field, and your DNA is how you read it. There's something haunting about déjà vu, that flicker of familiarity in a place you've never been, that second of recognition in a stranger's eyes. Moments so subtle they vanish before you can grasp them, but deep down, you've felt this before. Science calls it misfiring neurons, but mystics knew better. They called it bleed-through, fragments of parallel selves brushing against your awareness. Because when your consciousness shifts, your field becomes porous. And through those thin places in reality, other timelines leak through. But what determines which timelines bleed in? Your frequency. And what controls your frequency? Your DNA. Not by chance, by design. The ancients believed the body was a bridge, temple, a holy machine crafted to hold the infinite. But something changed. Somewhere along the timeline, the knowledge was fragmented, scattered across myths, buried in symbols, guarded in grimoires whispered in secret. Because those who remembered how to tune reality weren't just spiritual, they were dangerous. They couldn't be controlled. Because they knew the truth. Reality is not external. It's interactive. You are not the subject of your story. You are the selector of the storyline. And the switchboard is encoded in your cells. Experiments in epigenetics now confirm it. Your environment, your thoughts, your emotions can turn genes on or off. This means your DNA is not fixed. It is dynamic, responsive, not just to your physical surroundings, but to your inner world. When you shift internally, when you heal, when you remember, when you feel coherence, your DNA doesn't just adjust your biology. It adjusts your reality access, tunes you to new potentials, new probabilities, new versions of you that already exist in the quantum field. So the next time you feel a strange pull toward a city, a memory, a decision you can't explain, pause. You might be syncing with a timeline where that version of you already lives. And your DNA is guiding you there, through sensation, through intuition, through resonance. Because you're not making it up. You're reconnecting to the parts of you still alive in other frequencies of the infinite. Have you ever wondered why certain symbols feel alive? Why ancient geometry draws you in? Why spiral patterns, eyes within triangles, or serpents eating their tails trigger something you can't explain? It's not aesthetics, it's activation. Because symbols are not decorations. They're instructions. They are the visual remnants of a forgotten language. A language designed to resonate with your DNA. And that's why ancient cultures carved them in stone, painted them on temple ceilings, and encoded them into myths. They weren't just telling stories. They were programming memory. These weren't primitive beliefs. They were maps of multidimensional access. Take the serpent, for example, a universal symbol across continents and centuries. Why? Because it mirrors the helix, the coiling energy of the spine, the structure of DNA. To the ancients, the serpent wasn't evil. It was the reminder that the divine code is within you, coiled, sleeping, waiting to be awakened. And when awakened, it doesn't just heal your body. It alters your relationship with space, time, and self. This is where mysticism meets mechanics. Because when a symbol resonates with your inner code, something happens. The body heats, the heart races, the veil thins, and you begin to feel different. Not because anything outside changed, but because a strand within you recognized the signal. That's how the Grimoire speaks. Not in words, but in resonance. A sacred geometry woven through the language of vibration. Modern science is catching glimpses of this. We now know that certain sound frequencies can literally restructure water molecules. Your body is mostly water. Your DNA sits in that water. And when a sound or a symbol matches the resonant frequency of your dormant code, something unlocks. You remember, not as thought but as sensation, a deep knowing, a sudden shift in perception. You see things differently, not because you've learned more, but because you've tuned into another version of yourself. That's the secret. Awakening isn't about learning. It's about aligning. And the symbols, the rituals, the chants, the geometry, they were never meant to be worshipped. They were meant to guide your signal back to the frequency where all versions of you exist in harmony. The ancients called it ascension. Today we call it quantum shift. But at its core, it's the same process. Change the signal, and the field reorganizes around it. Because the grimoire isn't outside of you. It's the memory in your cells, whispering every time you feel something true. You've been taught to trust only what you can see, to believe that reality is fixed, bound by laws, locked in time, solid and linear. But deep down, you've always sensed otherwise. You've felt the subtle ripples, the strange alignments, the moments when time stretches or collapses, when thought becomes formed too fast to be coincidence. That's not imagination. That's interference from another version of reality responding to a shift in your frequency. And your DNA is the dial, Quantum mechanics confirms what mystics already knew. Reality is not a single stream. It's a field of potentials. Everything that could happen already exists as a probability wave. So why do you experience only one path? Because something collapses the wave. Something chooses the version that becomes real. That something is awareness. Your awareness. And the most direct extension of that awareness in the body is your DNA. It's not just a code of biology. It's a code of selection. It filters what version of the world your consciousness inhabits based on the signal it's receiving from within you. This is why inner transformation changes outer experience. Why healing trauma doesn't just bring peace. It changes your life. Because when you clear the static within, you tune your DNA to a new station. One where the version of you that's already whole, already aligned, already awake exists. And then you begin to merge, not through effort, through resonance. You begin to walk through a world that responds differently to your presence. Opportunities open, people shift, synchronicities multiply, and it's not magic. It's mechanics, the physics of consciousness. But here's what no one tells you. It's not always comfortable. Sometimes, shifting timelines feels like losing yourself, because the parts of you that anchored the old reality must dissolve. That confusion you feel? It's recalibration. That disorientation? It's your system adjusting to a new frequency field. Don't resist it. Breathe through it. Because the more you surrender, the faster the code rearranges. And the code is listening, not to your words, but to your alignment. You don't need to force reality. You need to match it. Feel the version of you that already lives the clarity you seek. Sense that reality as vividly as you can. And then let your body become the signal. Because your DNA isn't just responding to your thoughts. It's responding to your state. And when that state stabilizes, the timeline stabilizes too. The field reorganizes. The story changes. Not because you escaped anything, but because you finally remembered how to tune. There is no final destination in this process. No single timeline you're meant to arrive at. That's another illusion, a shadow of linear thinking in a multidimensional field. What exists instead is a constant conversation between your inner state and the quantum field. A dance, a rhythm, an unfolding. You're not walking toward a fixed fate. You're surfing probabilities, selecting realities based on moment-to-moment resonance. And your DNA is your board, keeps you upright. It stabilizes the signal. It holds the memory of every timeline you've ever touched, even if you don't remember it consciously. But your body does. Your field does. And sometimes, in the quiet, so do you. This is why you felt things that made no sense. Why some grief felt older than this life. Why certain joys felt impossibly familiar. These are not emotional accidents. They're timeline impressions, residue from versions of you existing right now in slightly different frequencies. And your DNA? It acts like a translator, pulling information from those parallel selves and feeding it into your intuition, your dreams, your body's knowing. So when you feel the urge to change, to move, to end, to begin, don't dismiss it. It might not be coming from this version of you. It might be a signal from another that's already aligned, reaching out to pull you forward. This is the deeper truth of manifestation. You don't attract what you want. You tune into the version of reality where that thing already exists. You don't make it happen. You make yourself available to it. And what makes you available? Not wanting, not wishing, resonating. When your thoughts, emotions, body, and breath are vibrating in coherence. You don't need to chase outcomes. You simply shift timelines. But coherence isn't always easy. We carry static, old stories, inherited beliefs, trauma patterns written into our blood. And these distort the signal. That's why inner work matters. Not to become better, but to become clearer. Because clarity isn't a concept. It's a frequency. And when your field becomes clear, you begin to experience a version of reality that was always there, but blocked by the noise. So this is your real power, not to control the field, but to calibrate to it. You are the code, the antenna, and the frequency. And every breath you take is a chance to retune, to drop the old resonance, to release the weight, to choose presence over programming. Because the field is listening, and your DNA is ready to remember. You may think this process is personal, that you're awakening, you're remembering, your shifts in reality are isolated experiences. But they're not. They are ripples, vibrations sent through the collective field, changing not just your world, but the field we all share. Because the quantum field is not separate for each person. It's one fabric, one sea of potentiality. And your shift in frequency creates echoes in the grid. This is why your healing matters, why your clarity matters, why your coherence is not a private victory but a broadcast. Every time you remember who you are, you make it easier for others to remember too. Not by teaching them, not by convincing them, by resonating. Your field becomes a tuning fork, and those around you begin to shift, sometimes without knowing why. This is the quiet revolution of frequency. Not loud, not violent, but unstoppable, because coherence is contagious. And in a world saturated with distortion, someone who radiates alignment stands out like a signal in static. But that visibility comes with its own challenge. As your frequency rises, you'll start to feel the pull from versions of yourself that still exist in old patterns. You'll feel the temptation to contract, to question, to return to what felt familiar, even if it was painful. This is not regression. It's a test of resonance. Not from the universe, but from within. It's your system asking, are you ready to stay in the new frequency? Even when the old timeline knocks. Because it will. Parallel realities don't disappear when you shift. They stay there, accessible, available, waiting to see if you'll tune back in. So the work becomes simple, not easy, but simple. Hold the frequency. When doubt arises, stay in signal. When fear whispers, stay in signal. When nothing outside confirms your new reality yet, still, stay in signal. Because the field will catch up. Reality will respond. But only when your resonance becomes stable. That's how timelines solidify. And it's not about perfection. It's about consistency. You don't need to have all the answers. You don't need to feel high vibe all the time. You just need to return, again and again, to presence, to breath, to the feeling of alignment in your body. That becomes your anchor, your shield, your signature. Because when your frequency becomes familiar enough, it becomes your new default setting. And from there, a new life unfolds. Not from force, not from control, but from remembrance. And your DNA, it knows this state. It's what it was coded for before the forgetting. Now you remember. There's a version of you that already lives in alignment. They don't need to visualize the path. They are the path. They don't seek the frequency. They are the frequency. And that version of you is not in the future. It's here, now, just vibrating at a slightly different wavelength. So the question isn't when will you become that version. The question is, are you willing to collapse the distance? Because that version has been trying to reach you, through whispers in dreams, through nudges you couldn't explain, through desires that never seemed to fit the life you were living. They weren't random. They were reminders that you are not becoming something new. You are reconciling with what's already real, in another fold of the field. Think of your life as a prism. Each shift in emotion, each surge of awareness, tilts the angle of the lens. And through that shift, a different color of reality emerges. Not because the light changed, but because your angle did. This is how timelines converge, not with noise, but with precision. You begin to match the pattern that another version of you has already stabilized. And in doing so, you invite that version to merge with this one. Not metaphorically, energetically, biologically, because your DNA is not just storing data. It's conducting integration. When the resonance is right, the boundaries dissolve. And suddenly, you begin to feel abilities awaken, clarity sharpen, truth settle in your bones. As if you've lived this before, because you have. This is what the ancients meant by timelines collapsing. Not destruction, union. All the fragmented selves, all the choices and paths, folding into coherence. This is the work of the soul, to gather itself across dimensions, to reclaim the scattered light, and to stand whole again. You don't do this by force. You do it by alignment. And as the parts of you once split by trauma, doubt, or fear begin to return, a quiet power rises. Not the kind that seeks control, but the kind that needs nothing to prove itself. Because when you remember who you are across timelines, you stop searching for validation. You start radiating truth. So take a breath. Feel the gravity of this moment. Not because it's rare, but because it's real. You've walked this spiral before, and this time you're ready to stay awake, to hold the signal, to merge the timelines, to live as the version of you who already knows. There is nothing left to seek, only something sacred to embody, and your DNA is already aligning, because the grimoire is open, the code is active, and this time you remember, there's a silence that comes not when the world stops speaking, but when you finally start listening, not to noise, but to the signal beneath everything. And when that silence settles in your bones, you realize something so simple, it almost escapes you. You've been here before, not in memory, not in story, but in essence. There was a moment, maybe lifetimes ago, where you stood at this same threshold, aware of the code, aware of the field, aware that you could step into a different version of reality. And that time you hesitated. You weren't ready to let go of the version of you that still needed proof, still needed control, still believed it was separate. But this time is different. You feel it, don't you? That soft pressure in your chest, that awareness just behind your eyes, that sense that something invisible has already shifted. You're not watching reality change. You're the change itself. So what will you do with this moment? Will you fall back into the rhythm of forgetting? Or will you anchor this frequency? Breathe into it, live through it, let it reshape how you move, speak, choose, because awakening isn't the end of the path. It's the beginning of participation, and your participation matters, more than you know, not just for you, but for every version of this world that is waiting to come into form through your alignment. The field is listening, your DNA is responding, and reality is already shifting. So ask yourself, with full presence, full breath, no pretense, what timeline will I choose now? Because the moment you ask that with awareness, the answer begins to unfold, not through force, but through frequency. And in that frequency, you don't just witness the new reality, you become it.